Hi, welcome to our webinar today. This is Michelle Diaz, the Education Program Manager. Thank you for joining us. If you're not familiar with Trees Atlanta, our mission is to plant, protect, and educate about the urban forest. This is our second webinar so far during this time of working from home, and a few housekeeping for today's webinar. If you have a question or a comment for the speaker, feel free to write it on the chat. She'll be stopping to answer some questions during the presentation. And she'll also allow some time at the end of the presentation to answer more questions. Our next, and then as we are learning how to use these new tools, and online education is still pretty new for us, please share any feedback you have for us. We will appreciate that. You will receive a survey email. Please feel free to please answer the survey and give us your feedback. Our next webinar will be on Saturday. It will be with Susan Pierce Cunningham, and she'll be teaching us on how to prune trees. Please visit treesatlanta.org/calendar for more information on how to get ready for the class and how to register and how to access the Zoom link. And thank you, Kelly Coles, today for joining us. She's going to be our speaker. Kelly is the BeltLine Arboretum coordinator. We've done this workshop before in person, and we're very excited to be able to change it a little bit and be able to provide it to you guys online. And she will be presenting about basic botany. We're very excited. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm excited to talk with you about how to see trees better and how to identify some of the native trees that you can find in Atlanta. So, as Michelle said, I work on the Beltline, and just a quick background, I'm sure a lot of you have been out there, but if not, I highly recommend it because we do have an arboretum there. So a lot of the trees that I'll be going over today, you could actually find walking out on the trail. Of course, the trees that I'm talking about are common, and you'll be able to find them in many green spaces around the city. Additionally, on the Beltline, we have a Piedmont prairie, and that's a really exciting thing because when people think about the Southeast, they mostly think about deciduous forests, which, makes sense because that is a lot of what dominates here. However, historically, there were actually pockets of Piedmont prairie all over the Southeast. And were environments that lightning visited regularly, and so wildfires naturally occurred. These were areas that there was high biodiversity because of the fires. So these fires swept through and they kept a lot of trees out of the place, but they allowed wildflowers and grasses to grow prolifically. So we have a replicate of that on the Beltline. We have over 500,000 grasses and perennials planted, and they're all native species. So when you're out there looking at the trees, make sure you take a look at all of that as well. Okay, so why we do this is because, like I said, it's an incredibly biodiverse habitat, so it's really good for pollinators. We now know that a lot of ground nesting birds really like being in places like this that have a thick growth. So instead of a lawn where everything is really flat, if you walk on the trail, you're going to see a lot of taller plants and, like I said, a lot of flowers. These types of plants are really great because they don't require as much human input once they're established. So we don't have to go out there and mow them every week during the growing season. Instead, we try to go in there and imitate a fire once a year around winter. And we do this because by mowing everything to the ground in the winter, it stimulates that native plant growth. So we're hoping that we'll get a higher diversity of native species by doing that. So we're not using as many fossil fuels, and we're not using as much water to keep the lawn green. Instead, we are, oh, I see a question. How do you imitate a fire? So our way of doing that is more imitating grazing animals. So we go in with hedge trimmers and weed whackers, and we cut everything about 4 or 5 inches down. So yeah, it's almost like mowing, except we don't mow it all the way to the ground. And what that does is lets a lot of sunlight in. So a lot of plants that need sun to grow get a chance to send up fresh leaves and yeah, send up fresh growth when the spring comes. All right, so these places, unlike a lawn, they actually also provide a lot of erosion control, and they filter water. If anybody has gone out driving or just walking down the street after a heavy rain in Atlanta, you probably know that we have some flood problems. Well, a Piedmont prairie is a great way to have a natural sponge, and the Piedmont prairie holds all that water in. So a lot of the times what happens in a city is when it rains, all that water just washes away. But when we plant native plants that grow taller and that have deeper root systems, we're actually able to utilize that water. So here are some more pictures of what a Piedmont prairie looks like on the trail. See some pollinators in there, some tall grasses. All right, and I'm sure most of you know why we love trees so much, but just quickly before we get into really getting to know some specific trees, it's important just to know why we all care so much for them. Of course, they filter air, they provide shade. There is a crazy study that was done that just blows my mind. It was a study that looked at temperatures in the city versus in a rural environment. And I'm not sure which city this was, but it was one without a lot of trees. And in the summertime at night, the city was 22 degrees hotter than the rural areas. So when we plant trees in cities, we provide more shade and we provide a way for the city to naturally cool, because what's happening, the discrepancy in that temperature is because cities have so much cement and impervious surfaces that just absorb all that sunlight and then just radiate it back out at night. Whereas more rural areas have more trees and they just have a natural cooling system built in. So we need more trees in cities. It'll cut down on energy costs and also just make cities a better place to live. As I said, with the Piedmont prairie, trees also absorb and slow stormwater. They provide great habitat, and believe it or not, they can slow traffic. So in areas where there are trees planted, traffic is usually 8 miles per hour slower, and people are happier in areas with trees. There have actually been studies done that looked at blood cortisol levels, so stress hormones, and the study found that in areas where there were a lot of trees, people had far less stress hormones coursing through their blood than in areas where there weren't any trees. And actually, there's another study that says that if you just take a whiff of essential oil from cedar trees, it lowers those stress hormones as well. So trees are amazing. They're doing things that we don't even fully understand yet, and we need them in our cities. Here in Atlanta, we are the city in the forest, so they're actually a huge part of our identity, and we've got to do what we can to make sure we maintain this canopy for the environment and for ourselves. So here's a picture from Piedmont Park. All right, now we are going to get into the reason that you're all here, which is the basic botany of trees. Today, we are going to be focusing mostly on the morphology of trees. So things that we can, characteristics that we can absorb, that we can look at with our eyes. In particular, we'll be looking at leaves and at bark. First though, what is a tree? I'm sure when I ask that, everybody can call to mind an image of a tree, but botanists actually have specific definitions of what is and isn't a tree, and there are debates over that. Usually it has to do with the height. So for our purposes, we are going to say that a tree is a woody plant that is 20 feet or taller, and these plants have an elongated stem or trunk that supports leaves. And they grow by expanding outwardly in the form of adding new bark and adding rings on to their inner cambium, xylem, and phloem, and then they also grow upwards. All right, so this is a diagram of a twig. And before we really get into looking at leaves and characteristics of leaves, we need to really understand how they grow on a tree. So you'll see on the left a diagram of a twig in the winter, and on the right you have the same twig except the twig in spring, so when the tree has grown its leaves. What we tend to focus on in the winter is buds before the trees have their leaves, because each species of tree is going to have a very distinctive bud. So each bud is enclosed by bud scales, and different species have a different number of scales. The scales are different colors and different shapes. But today, for our purposes, we will be focusing on the leaves because those buds have already opened up into leaves for us, which is going to make our job of identification a lot easier, actually. So on every twig, you have these areas of growth, and that is where the leaves are growing from, and that is called a node. In between the nodes, you have what's called an internode, and this is just an elongated part of the stem where no leaves are growing. So here's our node, here's another node, here's another node, and yes, that is where the leaves are growing. And that's important because the leaves are going to grow differently from the nodes depending on the species. So the way that the leaves grow is not random. Each species has a different way of growing their leaves that helps them allow the leaves to access the sun better so that they can photosynthesize. So some trees have oppositely growing leaves. And this means that if you were to look at a twig, if you're walking around outside and you want to know what a tree is, hopefully you can find a tree that has a twig that's low enough for you to hold and look at. So, you know, you can reach up and pull it a little closer to you so that you can look for the nodes. And the first thing you're going to look for when you do that is how the leaves are growing. So you find a node, and here's a node, here's a node, here's another node. And you look for how the leaves are growing from that node. So on opposite growing trees, you're going to have two leaves growing right across from each other at a node. If you have a tree that only has one leaf growing per node, that's called alternate. And if you have a tree that has whorled leaves that are growing out like the rays of the sun or petals on a flower, then you know you have whorled growth. And this is all very helpful information because, as I said, each tree has a different method of growing. And the good news is there are very few trees that grow opposite. So if you are out there and you pull a twig towards you and you see that the leaves are growing two per node opposite, then you're going to know you're looking at mad horse. So what that means is maples, ashes, dogwoods, or horse chestnuts. So that's the saying to remember, mad horse. So if it's a twig with opposite growth, you know you're looking at one of those trees. However, if it's alternate or if it's whorled, then you have to do some more work. So the next thing we're going to be looking at, once you've figured out the leaf arrangement, is leaf type. Now, we have simple leaves and we have compound leaves. And I have some more slides to elaborate on these two types of leaves. However, the important thing to note is that every leaf is growing on a petiole, which is a little stem that attaches to the twig. And in between the petiole and the twig, on every leaf, you're going to find an axillary bud. So every leaf has a bud at the base. On this leaf, which is a compound leaf, it also has a bud at the base. You'll notice it doesn't have a bud at the base of these leaflets because those are leaflets and not a full leaf. And that's what makes this a compound leaf. Feel free, if you have any questions about this, to type it into the chat box. This can be a little bit tricky. In class, we look at a lot of examples in person, but I will be explaining it using pictures right now. But yeah, feel free to ask any questions you might have. So when you're trying to determine whether a tree has a simple or a compound leaf, you're going to look for that bud. So simple leaves are leaves that probably look like what you imagine when you're thinking of a leaf. They can be lobed, like this oak leaf over here, as long as the lobes don't touch this midrib. So every leaf has a midrib, it has veins, it has a tip, and it has a base. And the things that we are going to be looking at today in more detail are the shape of the leaf blade and also the texture of the leaf margins. All right, so here are our simple leaves. And here is a compound leaf. So if you were to look at this and you aren't too familiar with trees, you might think that each of these is a leaf. However, remember what I said, that each leaf is going to have a bud at its base. So if you were to follow each of these leaflets to its base, you wouldn't find a bud. And that's because it's a leaflet, not a leaf. If you were to follow this entire structure to the base though, I have the chat box in the way so I can't see the base. Okay, if you were to follow the entire structure to the twig, you would find a bud. And that's a signal to you that you're looking at a leaf. The good news is that most compound leaves take a particular pattern. I'm going to try to minimize this chat box so I can see if y'all ask questions. Sorry. All right. Most compound leaves fall into a particular pattern. So here they are. We have our pinnate leaves, and these are leaves that have leaflets that are going opposite each other from this central midrib. And that central midrib on a compound leaf is called a rachis. So you've got even and odd pinnate patterns. And really what that has to do with is whether or not the leaf has a terminal leaflet. So you'll notice on the odd pinnate leaves, there is a terminal leaflet, and that gives that leaf an odd number of leaflets. And on the even pinnate leaf, there is no terminal leaflet. We also have trees that are bipinnate in Georgia, and those are our locusts, honey locusts and black locust. And what that means is that they branch twice. So you'll see here, there's just one branching. Here, the leaf splits, and then it splits again. We have palmate leaves as well, and that's something like your buckeye. And then we also have leaves that are trifoliate. And that's not so much a tree, but poison ivy actually is trifoliate. In Georgia, however, we do not have tripinnate plants. So really you're looking for something that's pinnate, bipinnate, or palmate. And some examples of pinnate leaves are your oaks and hickories. I mean, sorry, not your oaks, your ashes and hickories. All right, so you are out in the woods, you have looked at a twig, determined the leaf arrangement, determined the leaf type. The next thing that you are going to want to look at in terms of leaves is the leaf shape. And botanists have come up with a number of terms to describe the leaf shape. We are going to be focusing on these 8 right here. So there are more though, and there are actually some really good terminology books out there that are illustrated botanical terms. So for all of the different botany words, you're going to have a little picture that illustrates it for you, which is really helpful because there are a lot of words. But like I said, we're going to be focusing on these today. So ovate just means that the leaf is broadest below the middle of the leaf. So a lot of times these shapes are going to be referring to where the leaf is broadest. So keep an eye out for that. Obovate means that the leaf is broadest above the middle. Lanceolate means that the leaf is broadest about 1/3 of the way up. Elliptic is broadest in the middle. Acicular is needle-like. Cordate is heart-shaped. Palmate is just like the palm of your hand. And spatulate looks like a spatula. So I know these are a lot of terms. When you're just getting started out there, just describe the shape however it makes sense to you. And then when you refer to a tree identification book later, you'll be able to translate the words that you used into the words that botanists use. But just really the idea is to be looking for shapes, and the specific words will come with more practice. All right, So the next thing you're going to be looking at are leaf margins. So the leaf margin is really referring to the texture of the edge of the leaf. So entire means that it's just smooth. Lobed means that there are lobes, indentations. Dentate means that the edge of the leaf has teeth. Serrate means that the edge of the leaf has teeth and they point forward. Double serrate means that there are those teeth that point forward, but each tooth has smaller teeth on it. Crenate refers to leaves that have wavy edges. Cerulate refers to leaves that have very fine, small teeth. And ciliate means that there's a leaf that has little hairs all over the edges. And a lot of times to see that, you need to hold the leaf up to the sun, because often the hairs are kind of hard to see unless you're holding it into the sun, and then that reflects them. All right, bark is another thing that I tend to pay more attention to in winter. However, it is really, really helpful for identification. There are some species out there that have bark that no other tree has. So our sycamores have bark that is very, very unique. This picture here shows you the camouflaged looking part of the bark. So you've got these white patches, greenish brown patches, and then reddish brown cinnamony patches. And often sycamores from a distance look really, really white. So those white patches, there are very large sections of white on sycamores. To your left, you have hop hornbeam, and its bark is pretty distinctive too because it's very flaky and it likes to grow close to water. So if you're walking in woods that has a stream or a creek, then you're pretty likely to see hop hornbeams here in Georgia, and just look for that peely bark. And then something to remember, like I said, is it's just going to take a lot of practice to learn to see these things. What you're looking for is similarities and differences between tree bark. So down here, the last two pictures, we have two types of bark that are ridged. But the way I like to think about these two trees is that the tulip poplar here, or tulip tree, it does have ridges, but they're flattened, they're smoothed. They're almost more like the Appalachian Mountains, which are old and have eroded over time, versus this ash over here, which has these really sharp ridges, more like the Cascades or some mountains out west that are younger and have steep ridges. So you'll see patterns like that. The more that you look, the important thing is just to be looking. Also pay attention to the color of bark when you're looking for that. You'll see that the ash has almost grayer bark, and the tulip poplar here has almost a more cinnamony or corky color bark. Buds are really helpful in the winter before the trees get their leaves. So a lot of trees have very distinctive ones. The American beech in the middle, no other tree has a bud that looks like that. So this bud is very long and it's sharp, and it's that coppery color. I've heard it described as looking like a cigar. So all trees are going to have distinctive buds. The oak down here, you'll see that the tip of the twig here is very clustered with buds. And if you're looking at a branch and you see that, you almost certainly know you're looking at an oak, because oaks have buds and leaves that are whorled at the tip, and then they switch to alternate going down the stem. And then here we have a maple bud. Maple buds, which grow opposite, because remember, mad horse. Flowers are something else that are really helpful. We are in spring right now, so a lot of trees are just beginning to flower. Most of these trees, I believe, already have flowered, but the silver bells, I still can see trees in Atlanta sometimes that have their flowers. But flowers are helpful because each tree is going to have unique flowers. Sometimes they're really, really tiny. Oak flowers are really tiny, hard to see if they're far up in the tree, but there are some species that have bigger, more charismatic flowers, like this pawpaw flower here. So that's just one more thing to be looking for when you're trying to figure out what a tree is. Fruit, just like flowers, can be really helpful. So here on the left, we have these blackberry-looking fruits, and those are from a mulberry tree. On the far right, we have a persimmon, and yeah, if you saw a tree that had that on it, you would know right away it's a persimmon. These two in the middle are a good example of how fruits can be similar but different, because at first glance, both of these are drupes, and they're both kind of a dark blue purple color. They're about the same size, but if you look more closely, and I know this sassafras picture is somewhat blurred, but if you look more closely, you'll see that the sassafras has this really interesting bright pinkish red structure that is holding on to this fruit at the end. Whereas the hackberry just has a pretty skinny stem. So you're looking for things like that when you're looking at trees. You're really trying to see all the details. Let's see, I see a new question. Okay, so a drupe is a type of fruit. Botanists also have all kinds of words for different types of fruits. And I actually have my guide to trees is called Native Trees of the Southeast. And at the beginning of it, it has some little pictures that illustrate some of these words. It has a section that's all about fruits. And if I could find it quickly, I'll just give you some more of the names from it. Okay, so there are words like drupe, there are words like samaras, legume, berry, follicle. So basically that's just a specific type of fruit, and different trees have different types. We're not going to go into too much detail today. However, if you are to get a tree ID book, that'll be helpful. But basically a drupe has a stony pit instead of seeds. So that's something to look for. And it's not a stupid question at all. It's a very fine-tuned little detail of botanist language. So like I said, there's a lot of little fine-tuned things like that, and you'll learn them. All right, so seeds and nuts are really, these are just a different type of fruits, basically. So this is a samara, which is on a maple. And I'm sure a lot of us have played with these when we were kids or when we're adults. So this is a structure that holds the seed of the maple. And if you were to hold this up in the air and drop it, it would helicopter to the ground. So they're really fun to play with, but they're distinctive to maples. And then of course we have our acorns on oaks, and some acorns look very similar to each other, but every now and then you're going to find a species of oak that has a very distinctive acorn that's going to be helpful for ID. So here in the middle we have a bur oak, and the bur oak is amazing because it's a huge acorn and it has this fringed edge and nothing else looks like it. So it's really helpful. And then on the far right we have a cottonwood, and you can see why it's called a cottonwood, and nothing else that I know of looks like that. Again, more structures for holding seeds. Our tulip poplar has a flower-like seed pod, and then our sweet gums have these, I'm sure you've seen sweet gums, maybe even tripped on them before. And then our pines have these beautiful pine cones. I will say in the winter, look up into trees because often trees hold on to their fruits all winter long. So especially something like a sweet gum, if you look up and there are no leaves, you're not sure what the tree is. If it's sweet gum, you're going to see some of these sweet gum balls, and then you'll be able to figure out what it is. Here's some more examples of just these different forms. So here, actually, I forgot I had this slide in here. This kind of gives you an example of the different types of fruit. So you've got a typical seedy fruit, like a mulberry, and then you have this drupe. We have some trees that are in the legume family, so they have actual bean pods that are their fruit. And then again, we have these samaras, and then pine cones. Another type of cone is on our bald cypress, and it looks very different than a pine cone, but it's also referred to as a cone. And then you've got a sweet gum ball. So yeah, all kinds of different ways that trees produce fruit and spread their seeds. Tree structure and size is something you can use for identification. So this doesn't always work in the forest, but if you are on the Beltline looking at trees in the Arboretum or trees that are growing with a lot of sun, the shape of the tree is often quite distinctive. In the forest, trees tend to grow in kind of a general shape depending on species, but they'll also grow a lot crazier just because there's a lot more competition for sunlight. So they will grow however they need to access that sun. But here's an example of an American elm, which has this vase-like shape. So the trunk is pretty short before it starts branching out, and it goes out into this big vase. And then here's our bald cypress. It has a more pyramidal, typical kind of evergreen shape. And then on the far right is our live oak, and it's really spreading. So those are some good examples of trees that do have distinctive forms. And if you saw them from afar, you might know what they are just because of the way that they look growing. Another thing to be aware of when you're out there in the field is to really think about where you are. So we live here in the Piedmont, and we're right in between the coastal plain and the mountains. So the Ridge and Valley, the Cumberland Plateau, and the Blue Ridge Mountains. So depending on where you are, if you're hiking around or walking around in a park in Atlanta, you're going to be probably in more of an oak hickory forest. But if you were further down in the coastal plain, you could be in a place that's more of like a swampy area, or even a longleaf pine forest, which I highly recommend people looking more into. They're incredible ecosystems that they're not as prevalent as they once were. They used to cover 90 million acres and now are only about 1% of that range. But the point is that there are very distinctive plants that grow in a longleaf pine forest, just as there are very distinct plants that grow in an oak hickory forest. If you're hiking in the mountains, if you get to the summit, you could see a spruce. Actually, if you go up to North Carolina ever, to Mount Mitchell, it's a crazy ecosystem because it has spruces and firs that you would really only see in boreal Canada and the most northern parts of the country. So depending on where you are, you're going to see different species. All right, so now is the part where we're going to get into specific trees of Atlanta. The first tree we're going to talk about is a water oak, and this is a very common tree. It used to be planted a lot as street trees and as yard trees because they grow very quickly, but we have learned since planting so many of them that they are fairly short-lived. I still really like these trees, but they're not planted as often anymore just because they tend to have pretty short lives. But it's a great tree because it does grow so quickly that it can be used in restoration projects. So in areas that used to be pine plantation, in abandoned agricultural fields, you can plant water oaks and they'll spread quickly, help stabilize the soil, bring life back to an area. So they're great for that. I am going to talk a little bit about bark that's more distinctive, that's going to be helpful for ID. I won't go as much into it as I would in the winter, but water oaks do have pretty distinctive bark. It is pretty smooth, and when I say smooth, when we're talking about trees, that often doesn't mean, you know, smooth as a baby's skin or something like that. It's still going to be a little bit bumpy, but overall it's smooth. It doesn't really have ridges. It has often this bluish green lichen growing, and that's going to be a really good indicator that you're looking at a water oak. Other trees, of course, grow lichen too, but many water oaks have this particular colored lichen and that smoother bark. All right, so looking at the leaves, we can see that this leaf here is a simple leaf. It's not compound. So a short lifespan for an oak, I think that, I don't know water oak's maximum age, but I think that around 70 years or so, whereas a lot of trees, a lot of oaks can grow or can live much, much longer than that. Yeah, that's a good question. The time of a short lifespan is very different for a tree than a human too, so yeah. All right, so I included a picture of the full leaf, and I also included a picture of the leaves growing on the stem so that you can see the leaf arrangement. So if you look down here, you try to find a node. So you find a leaf and you find where it's growing, and you know you have a node. If you look, you see that there's only one leaf growing per node. If you move further up, like I said, oaks grow whorled at their tips. So at the tip of this leaf, you'll see a whorl of leaves. And further down the stem, you see an alternate arrangement. So that's another important thing when you're in the field, is trees are tricky. So don't just look at one leaf and don't just look at one branch. Try to look at as much as you can on a tree, because even within a species, there can be a lot of variability. And in particular with oaks, they tend to hybridize with each other. And on the same tree, you can have leaves of totally different shapes. And, you know, if you only looked at the tip, you might think this was just whorled. But if you move further down the twig, you see that it has an alternate growth form. So that's indicative of oaks. All right, so let's talk about the leaf shape and the leaf margin. Looking at this, I think this is a perfect example of a spatulate leaf. So this is almost shaped like a spatula. And I hope you can see in the picture, there's really no teeth or waviness or anything like that. It's what we would call entire. Some water oaks, I will say, have deeper lobes, and so you would say that they're lobed, but this one here we would just call entire. All right, our next tree is another oak. So remember, like I said, it's going to have whorled leaves at its tip and an alternate leaves going down the twig. And all of these leaves came from the same tree. So this gives you an example of how variable the leaf shape can be and why it's so important to look at a lot of different leaves on one tree. As I said before, a good guidebook, or maybe I didn't say this, but I should now, a good guidebook is going to give you the full range that a leaf of a species of tree can exhibit. So for instance, like I said, the one that I have is called Native Trees of the Southeast, an identification guide. It's really helpful. At the beginning, there's a big key that helps you key out all the species of trees. And then there are species descriptions of each of those trees. And each one tells you about the bark and about the leaves. So for the southern red oak, it would tell you the variability of shapes that it can take. So if you look at this, let's try to figure out where the leaf is broadest. So in these first few leaves, the leaf is broadest above the middle, and so that's obovate. But in this last leaf here, it's actually broadest more like below the middle to the middle. So we say that the red oaks are obovate to ovate. And looking at the margins, you can see that the margins are lobed. So we say the margins are lobed. Here's another oak. So we know the growth form, the arrangement of leaves on this stem, but let's look at the leaf shape. So most white oaks are going to have pretty consistent leaf shapes, luckily. And what that is obovate. So if you look, most of these leaves are broadest above the middle. So that's obovate. Another thing to note about white oaks is their bark. They're one of those trees that has incredibly distinctive bark. So if you were walking around in the woods and you saw a tree with kind of palish, light brown, grayish bark that is flaking, then that's a good indicator that you're looking at a white oak. And like I said before, this is going to take a lot of practice. So I remember when I first started learning about bark, I thought I knew a white oak. It seemed completely iconic. And I went out into the woods and I just kept thinking that several different trees were white oaks, because there are trees that have peely bark, but it's not quite as peely as this. So basically what I'm saying is just get out there and look at trees for sure. Another thing that's interesting about white oaks is that their acorns are actually edible. So they're quite bitter unless you boil them multiple times, but we know now that indigenous peoples used to make flour out of those acorns. And I have actually made some cookies out of it, and it's quite delicious. So our black gum, this is another tree that has pretty distinctive bark. It looks like an alligator's hide, so we call it an alligator bark tree. There is another tree that has similar bark to this, and that's the American persimmon. So, you know, if you see a tree with blocky bark like this, a good idea is to pull out a tree guide and try to figure out based on the leaves whether you're looking at a black gum or a persimmon. Or if you're lucky enough to see it when there's fruit on the tree, the fruit is going to be very different. All right, so let's look at the leaves on this black gum. I've shown you here this one leaf because it's pretty different than this one. So this leaf, I would say, is more elliptical. It's broadest in the middle. But if you look at this leaf, it's broadest above the middle, so it's obovate. So again, there's that variability on a single tree. And also on this leaf, the margin is entire. It doesn't really have teeth, it's smooth. Over here though, the top of the leaf is a little wavy, which we call crenate. So black gum is another one that has some variability. And you can tell going up the stem that the leaves are growing alternate. So just one leaf per node. And black gums are actually another really cool tree because bees really, really like the flowers. And so it's a great pollinator tree. It's great for wildlife too because the berries are edible. And this is actually another thing that I would call a drupe rather than a berry because it has a big pit in the middle. And it's edible. You can actually make jams with it. They're quite bitter though, I'll say, a bit sour. All right, so this is our first compound leaf. And you know that because if you were to follow this entire structure to the base, to the twig, you would find a bud there. So that indicates that it's this whole thing that is a leaf. And each of these are just leaflets because none of them have a bud at their base. And we know that because this leaf fits that pinnate pattern that we talked about. And in fact, it would be odd pinnate because it does have a terminal leaflet. All right, so when we're talking about compound leaves, often when we're describing the leaves, we describe the leaflets. So if you look at this, at the leaflets, I tried to get a picture that shows the margin because the margins of pignut hickories are actually toothed. So we would call that serrate because it's very small teeth. And also the shape is, it can be lanceolate. So it's kind of broadest about a third of the way up, but it can also be obovate where it's broadest above the middle. And you can see that here. So there's some variability there. This is a good tree to look nut for because if you look at this, you can see that there's almost a little snout like a pig would have at the tip of this nut. And that's really helpful because it's called a pignut hickory. An alternative for why pignut hickories are called pignut is that early settlers used to feed the nuts to their pigs. So they're quite bitter. They are actually edible, but they're quite bitter. But the pigs liked them. All right, so the bark of hickories and ashes is quite similar to each other. They tend to have these diamond patterns. I hope you can see in this picture, but the ridges often intersect a little into these diamond patterns. And yeah, many hickories and ashes have similar bark. They have similar compound leaves. But remember, the difference between ashes and hickories is going to be found in that mad horse saying. So the ashes grow opposite, but then hickories grow alternate. So here we just have one leaf per node. So we know even though this compound leaf looks similar to an ash and the bark has diamond patterns like an ash, we can see here that because the leaf is growing alternate, we know we're looking at a hickory instead. So that's something to be aware of. Sweet gums are another tree that are great for wildlife. They are often loathed a little bit because they hold on to their fruits during the winter, which is helpful for ID. But when they start to drop those fruits, those sweet gum balls are definitely a tripping hazard, but animals really like them. And the trees produce beautiful color in the autumn. They have a wide range of colors from orangey and red to deep purple. And their leaves are our first palmate leaf, and they also have serrated margins. They grow alternate. And their bark, I would not say is completely distinctive. It takes a lot of looking at it to really train your eye to know that you're looking at a sweet gum. It's one that still gets me sometimes. So I have heard that part of the sweet gum was used for chewing gum, but I don't think it was the actual gum ball. I don't know if everyone can see these questions, but the question was, can you eat the inside of the sweet gum balls? I don't think that humans can eat them, but other animals really, really love them. But yes, I think it was the inner part of the bark that was used for chewing gum. Okay, and yes, so the bark is not completely distinctive. It almost looks similar to tulip tree bark, except I think sweet gum bark is grayer, whereas tulip tree bark tends to be a lighter brown color. All right, and American beech. This is one of my favorite trees. They like to grow in moist woods. They're often found growing close to streams. They have very easy to recognize bark. It's very smooth. At the base, it can be a little bit wrinkled, almost like an elephant, and it is that light gray color of an elephant. The leaves also, I think, are pretty distinctive. They're our first leaf that is ciliate, so the margins actually have hairs. And you do need to hold them up to the sun sometimes to really be able to see those hairs, but they are there, especially on freshly grown leaves. And the shape, it's another one that can be a little bit variable, but it's broadly elliptical. For the most part, it's broadest toward the middle of the leaf. And this is another of our trees that grows alternate. And actually, this is a nut that is edible. So I have heard that you don't want to eat too many beech nuts, but you can cook them, you can roast them, and they're quite delicious. And animals really love them too. So the tulip tree, you might remember me calling them tulip poplars earlier, and I'm trying not to do that as much because it's a misnomer. Tulip trees are not poplars at all. Poplars are a whole family of trees, but the tulip tree isn't that. The tulip tree is actually part of the magnolia family. And you can really see that when you look at the flower. It's called a tulip tree because it also looks like a tulip, but if you think about a magnolia flower, even though most magnolia flowers are white, the shape of this flower looks quite similar. And this tree is another of my favorite trees because they're iconic of our forests. So if you're walking through a green space around Atlanta, you're sure to see a tulip tree. And one of the best ways to identify it is by its trunk, because these trees get really tall and they often don't branch until 60 or so feet up the tree. So indigenous people use them to make canoes because of just how strong and straight their wood is. And another way to identify them is their bark. So like I said, it can trick me up a little bit because it can look similar to the sweet gum bark a little bit. But the difference is really that this bark almost looks like a cat scratched it. So it's got these ridges, and the ridges often look pretty parallel to each other. And the color of the bark, once you look at enough tulip trees, becomes pretty distinctive. So it's kind of a cinnamony, almost the color of a cork, a lightish brown. However, I've also included this picture to the left of the mature tulip tree bark because this is a young tulip tree. And it's important to note that the bark on trees can look quite different depending on the age of the tree. So on this young tulip tree, the bark is smooth, there are white patches, and there are these kind of reddish brown streaks in certain places. Very, very different than the mature tree. Oh, I think that I have a question that I missed. Let's see. Given that leaves are so varied from tree to tree, and even bark can look the same from tree to tree, would you say that identifying a tree relies more on how a combination of visual characteristics adds up to an ID? So this tree has this shape leaf, this fruit, this bark, and this climate, or a single unique identifier in one of the categories. So if this tree has this fruit, which has this unique shape. Unfortunately, that's a great question, but unfortunately, one of the most frustrating things you'll learn when beginning to identify trees is that there really, for the most part, is not one completely identifying structure that you're going to be able to find all of the time. So, for instance, trees do have unique flowers, and the flowers are very helpful for identification, but there are plenty of times of year where you're not going to be able to see the flower or see the fruit. So really learning to identify trees comes down to just a lot of practice. The more you practice, the more familiar you're going to get with all the variability from tree to tree. So yeah, unfortunately, I wouldn't say that there is really a single unique identifier. I would say it's more just looking at all of these different characteristics together. So yes, learning to identify trees, definitely, it takes a lot of time, but it's very fulfilling and exciting. It's almost like learning a new language. It definitely is a new way of seeing. And I found that since beginning to identify trees, my senses are a lot sharpened when I'm hiking because I'm aware of so many more subtleties than I ever was before. So yeah, for this tulip tree though, there is a pretty distinctive feature. When they have their leaves, no other tree has a leaf that's shaped quite like this. So I've heard it described as looking kind of like a cat's face, an upside down cat's face, or here, an upright cat's face. In botany, the term is orbiculate because if you were to outline this, not including the deep lobes, it would be almost a circular shape. All right, now I wanted to briefly go over these pines, and then I'm going to give a little bit of time for questions before we finish up. So there are really 3 different species of pines that you can find in Atlanta. The 4th tree that there's some debate over whether it would really have been native here is the longleaf pine, which is my favorite pine. However, I didn't include it because it's very unlikely that you're going to run into that. It tends to grow more in the coastal plains, and within the Piedmont, there are very few places that it would be. Ridges, very dry, rocky ridges above a river, it could be, but the tree is so endangered that it's very unlikely to find it in the city. But this loblolly pine, you're definitely going to see, and you are probably quite familiar with. The way to identify pine trees, though, is going to be pretty different than the deciduous trees that we've been looking at up to this point. So with a pine, what you're going to be looking at is the number of needles per fascicle. And a fascicle is this little sheath, this little bundle that holds these needles together. So if you're looking at a loblolly pine, and most of the time you'll be lucky enough to find a bundle of needles already on the ground under the tree. Otherwise, if there's a branch low enough, you can look at it that way. So loblollies have 3 needles per bundle, and they're pretty dark green, and they tend to be between 6 and 9 inches. So aside from the longleaf pine, which you're not really going to see, this is the pine that has the longest needles that's native to Atlanta. And its bark has these rectangular strips, these rectangular plates. The Virginia pine has the shortest needles, even though the next pine we're going to talk about is called shortleaf pine. Virginia pine actually has the shortest. They're between 1.5 and 3 inches, and they're strongly twisted, like you see here. And there are 2 of them per bundle. Their bark is also different than loblolly because it's more flaky and scaly than loblolly. And then the shortleaf pine, its needles are going to be between 2.5 and 5 inches. Just like with Virginia pine, there are 2 needles per fascicle, but these are not twisted at all, and they're often a little bit longer. But you can see here, they're just totally flat sprays, whereas with the Virginia pine, you can see that it's strongly twisted. And even just looking at this picture here on the branch, you can tell that the needles are twisted. Whereas here you can just tell that the shortleaf pine needles are very straight. So that is how you identify the pines. Now I can see it's 12:53, so I'd like to give some time for questions. If anybody has any, you can type them into the webinar chat box or else the Q&A section. All right, so it looks like we don't really have any questions right now. If anybody does have any questions later, you can feel free to email me those questions. My email is kcoles@treesatlanta.org. Thank you all for coming and joining me on this webinar. I hope that it gave you some different things that you can look for when you're trying to identify trees out in the field. I know it's a lot of information, but again, the point isn't to memorize all of these trees right now, but really to be able to know characteristics to look for in the field so that we can cure plant blindness and really start to see our plant family out there. So I hope this gave you the tools that you need to do that, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Hope to see you at another webinar, maybe Saturday or next week. Have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Bye.